There's a version of American history you were handed in school, tidy and reassuring, the kind that fits neatly on a timeline poster. And then there's the other version, the one that actually happened. Over more than 250 years, 45 men have sat behind that desk in the Oval Office, and nearly every one of them carried something the textbooks left out. Cover-ups, bribes, wars fought without a declaration. Secrets buried so deep that some of them took a century to surface. Tonight we're going to walk through all of it. 100 real documented secrets and scandals from the presidents of the United States, moving in order from George Washington all the way to the present day. Nothing invented, nothing exaggerated, just the parts of the story that tend to get quietly skipped over. Some of it will surprise you, some of it might unsettle you a little. All of it is true, or, where historians still argue about it, will tell you honestly that they argue. So get comfortable, let your eyes rest. If you like falling asleep to true stories like this one, it helps more than you'd think to leave the video playing, and maybe subscribe for the next one, but that's not why we're here tonight. We're here because it starts, as all of it does, with the first man to ever hold the office. Let's begin with secret number 1. It's 1793, and George Washington is only a few years into a job that had never existed before his own presidency. Europe is on fire. France, having just executed its king, is now at war with nearly every monarchy around it, and under the old alliance treaty from the Revolutionary War, America is technically obligated to help. Washington doesn't ask Congress, he doesn't wait for a vote. He simply issues a proclamation, on his own authority, declaring the United States neutral in the conflict. It sounds sensible enough now, but at the time it split his own cabinet in two. Alexander Hamilton argued the president had every right to make that call alone. Thomas Jefferson argued the opposite, that Washington had just quietly claimed a power the Constitution never gave him, wandering into territory that belonged to Congress. It was the first real fight over how much a president could do without asking anyone's permission, and in a way that argument has never really ended. That's secret number 1, and it's part of the reason Hamilton and Jefferson could barely stand to be in the same room by the time Washington's first term was over. Our second secret happened just a year later, and this time Washington didn't send someone else to handle the problem. He went himself. Farmers out in western Pennsylvania were furious over a new federal tax on whiskey, a drink that, for a lot of them, doubled as currency. The protests turned violent. Tax collectors were tarred and threatened, and Washington responded by federalizing roughly 13,000 militiamen, more soldiers than he'd commanded at some points during the Revolution itself. Then he put on his old uniform and rode out with them, becoming the only sitting president in American history to personally lead troops in the field against his own citizens. By the time the army reached western Pennsylvania, most of the resistance had already evaporated, but the message was unmistakable. The new federal government could and would use force to collect a tax. Historians still debate whether it was a necessary show of strength for a fragile young country, or the first small taste of federal power turned inward on its own people. Here's where things get a little softer, and a lot less certain. Long before he was ever a general or a president, a young Washington wrote a handful of letters to a woman named Sally Fairfax, the wife of one of his closest friends and neighbors. In them, he speaks of a fire he cannot extinguish, of a passion he wishes he could confess plainly but cannot. Nothing improper is ever proven. There is no confirmed affair, no romance beyond the page. Historians remain genuinely divided over whether this was simply the flowery, theatrical language young men of that era used with each other's wives, a kind of harmless courtly performance, or a real and aching attraction Washington carried quietly for years. We'll never know for certain, and it's worth sitting with that uncertainty rather than pretending the letters say more than they do. That's our third secret, and maybe a small reminder that even the most carved-in-stone historical figures were, once, just uncertain young people. Now we move forward a few years, to the presidency of John Adams, and to a set of laws that get far less attention than they deserve. In 1798, with fears of French spies and war fever running high, Adams signed what became known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. One part of the law let the government deport non-citizens it simply judged dangerous. No trial required. The other made it a crime to publish anything false, scandalous, or malicious about the federal government or its officials. In practice, that meant newspaper editors who criticized Adams himself could be, and were, arrested and prosecuted for it. It's a strange thing to learn about the same generation that had just fought a revolution partly over the right to speak freely, but there it was, one of the earliest presidents signing laws that punish people for criticizing him. That's secret number 4. Quiet and easy to miss in most classrooms, but enormous in what it revealed about how fragile those new freedoms still were. And that fear of France wasn't paranoia out of nowhere. It had a real trigger, and that's our 5th secret. In the years just before, Adams had sent diplomats to Paris to try to smooth over rising tensions with the French government. Instead of being welcomed to the negotiating table, the American delegation was quietly approached by 3 French agents, later referred to in official documents only as X, Y, and Z, who made it clear that talks wouldn't even begin without a personal bribe to French officials, on top of a loan to France itself. The Americans refused and sailed home. When Adams published the correspondence, with the agents' identities hidden behind those 3 letters, the country erupted in outrage, and the United States found itself in an undeclared, unofficial war with France at sea, one historian simply called a quasi-war. Adams tends to be remembered for the fear-driven laws he signed around this same moment, but here's the thing worth remembering too. He also managed to keep that undeclared war from ever tipping into a full one. 5 secrets in, and we've barely left the 18th century. But the man about to take that same office next would carry secrets of his own, quieter ones in some ways, but no less complicated. Let's turn now to the 3rd President of the United States. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And yet the man who wrote those words held hundreds of human beings in bondage across his lifetime, and among them was a woman named Sally Hemings. This brings us to secret number 6, and it's one that took the country the better part of 2 centuries to fully accept as documented fact. For generations, the relationship between Jefferson and Hemings, a woman he legally enslaved at his Monticello estate, was treated by many as rumor, whispered about in his own lifetime, and dismissed by a good number of historians long after. Hemings began accompanying the Jefferson household as a very young teenager, and over the years that followed, she gave birth to children who, according to the testimony of people enslaved at Monticello, and to Jefferson's own careful farm records, were fathered by Jefferson himself. The question hung unresolved for generations, until 1998, when a Y chromosome DNA study compared descendants of Hemings's youngest son, Eston, against the Jefferson male line and found a match. 2 years later, in 2000, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which oversees Monticello today, released its own research committee's findings and concluded that Jefferson was, in all likelihood, the father of all 6 of Sally Hemings's children. It's worth sitting with what that means, gently, before we move on. The man who shaped the language of American liberty fathered children with a woman who was, under the law of his own era, his legal property, with no power to refuse him anything. Historians describe the relationship today not as a romance but as one defined, at its core, by an imbalance of power that no affection could undo. Let's turn now to secret number 7, which lived entirely inside Jefferson's own conscience. In 1803, an extraordinary opportunity landed on his desk. France was offering to sell the vast Louisiana territory, doubling the size of the United States almost overnight, for a price that worked out to just a few cents an acre. Jefferson wanted the deal badly, but there was a problem only he seemed to fully appreciate. Nowhere in the Constitution did it say a president had the authority to simply acquire foreign territory by treaty. Jefferson was, by conviction, a strict constructionist, a man who believed the federal government could only do what the Constitution explicitly permitted, and he privately agonized over this. He even drafted language for a constitutional amendment that would have granted the power retroactively, so the purchase might rest on solid legal ground. But time was short, Napoleon's offer might vanish at any moment, and so Jefferson quietly set his own scruples aside and pushed the treaty through regardless. The Louisiana Purchase became one of the great triumphs of his presidency, built in part on a constitutional shortcut its own architect wasn't entirely sure was legal. Secret number 8 belongs not to Jefferson himself, but to the man standing one heartbeat from his office. Aaron Burr, Jefferson's own vice president, was already a source of quiet unease inside the administration, And in the summer of 1804, he did something that would follow him for the rest of his life. He shot and killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel in New Jersey, while still serving as the sitting Vice President of the United States. He was never prosecuted for it, but Burr's troubles were only beginning. Over the next few years, he became entangled in a murky scheme, never fully explained even now, that seemed to involve raising a private army and carving out some kind of independent territory somewhere in the American West, quite possibly at Spanish expense. Jefferson, alarmed, had him arrested and pushed hard, publicly and privately, for a treason conviction. In 1807, a jury acquitted Burr, in part because the constitutional bar for proving treason is deliberately famously high. Burr walked free, his political career effectively finished, and the truth of what he actually intended has never been fully settled. By secret number 9, we've moved into the presidency of Jefferson's close friend and successor, James Madison. In August of 1814, during the War of 1812, British troops marched into the young nation's capital and set fire to the White House itself, along with the Capitol and other government buildings, while Madison and his government fled the city ahead of them. Dolly Madison is remembered, in one of the more celebrated moments of the era, for saving a portrait of George Washington before the building burned around it. But the burning itself pointed to something less flattering than any single act of heroism. For years, despite repeated warnings that the Capitol lay dangerously exposed, military preparation around Washington City had been thin, underfunded, and slow. Critics, some inside Madison's own party, accused him of leaving the seat of government essentially undefended through simple neglect, a lapse the British were only too glad to exploit. And secret number 10 carries us into the presidency that followed. James Monroe's, an era so unusually calm that it earned the nickname the Era of Good Feelings. Even here, though, a shadow crept quietly in. Monroe's Treasury Secretary, William H. Crawford, came under suspicion during the financial turmoil of the Panic of 1819, accused by rivals of using his office for personal advantage and of quietly maneuvering toward his own presidential ambitions while still serving in Monroe's cabinet. Nothing was ever proven against him in any formal sense, and Monroe's presidency remains, by the standards of this list, remarkably free of real scandal. But the whispers around Crawford were enough to remind the country that good feelings, in politics, rarely last forever. 10 secrets down now, and the story is about to grow considerably louder. Coming up, a bitterly disputed election, a president accused of striking a secret bargain for his own office, and the rise of a man whose presidency would reshape the country in ways both celebrated and deeply troubling. The election of 1824 remains one of the strangest contests in American history, and it gives us our 11th secret. 4 candidates split the vote that year: John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and Henry Clay, and when the ballots were finally counted, Andrew Jackson had won both the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, but not the outright majority the Constitution required. So the decision fell to the House of Representatives. And there, Henry Clay, who as Speaker of the House wielded enormous influence and who had himself finished fourth, threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. Adams won. Then, within days, Adams named Henry Clay his Secretary of State, a position widely regarded at the time as the natural stepping stone to the presidency itself. Jackson and his supporters were furious, and they gave the arrangement a name that has stuck for 2 centuries, the corrupt bargain. Now, it's worth being honest about what we actually know here and what we don't. No letter, no confession, no hard evidence has ever surfaced proving that Clay and Adams struck an explicit deal, votes in exchange for a cabinet post. Historians remain divided to this day over whether it was genuine corruption or simply 2 ambitious men whose interests happened to align at a convenient moment. What we do know is that the accusation poisoned Adams's entire presidency, and it fueled a furious, 4-year campaign of revenge from Jackson that would end quite differently the second time around. That fury carries us into secret number 12, and into the Jackson White House itself, where a controversy that began as pure gossip somehow toppled half a cabinet. Not long after Jackson took office, his Secretary of War, John Eaton, married a woman named Margaret, known to history as Peggy Eaton. Peggy had a complicated reputation in Washington society, and rumors swirled that she and Eaton had carried on an affair before her first husband's death. Led by the wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, the wives of Jackson's cabinet members began socially shunning Peggy Eaton, refusing to receive her, refusing to sit near her, turning what should have been a minor social slight into a full-blown crisis of loyalty inside the administration. Jackson, whose own late wife Rachel had endured brutal public gossip of her own, took the Eaton affair personally and defended Peggy fiercely. The feud dragged on for 2 years, deepened Jackson's rift with Calhoun, and eventually contributed to Calhoun's resignation as vice president. By 1831, Jackson had grown so frustrated that he forced a nearly complete purge of his own cabinet just to clear the poison out of the room. Secret number 13 asks something harder of us, and it deserves to be told plainly, without softening and without sensationalizing it, because it is one of the genuine tragedies in American history. Jackson championed and, in 1830, signed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the forced relocation of Native American nations, including the Cherokee, from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to territory west of the Mississippi. He did this despite a ruling from the Supreme Court itself, in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, that such removal violated the Cherokee Nation's own sovereignty and was unconstitutional. Jackson pressed forward regardless. Over the years that followed, thousands of Cherokee and members of other affected nations were forced onto long, brutal marches west, on a journey that would come to be known as the Trail of Tears, and thousands died along the way, from cold, from disease, from exhaustion and grief. It is not a minor footnote in Jackson's presidency. It is one of the clearest instances in this entire list of a president using the full power of his office in direct defiance of the nation's highest court, and the human cost of that choice is part of the documented American record, carried forward in the memory of the descendants of those who survived it. Secret number 14 takes us into the fight Jackson seemed to relish more than any other, his war against the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson viewed the National Bank as a dangerous concentration of financial power in the hands of wealthy elites, and he moved aggressively to dismantle it, vetoing its recharter and pulling federal deposits out of its vaults. His opponents accused him of reckless, almost authoritarian overreach, of a president bending the machinery of government to a personal grudge. Around the same time, Jackson expanded what came to be called the spoils system, rewarding political loyalty with government jobs on a scale no president had before, a practice summed up in the era's own blunt phrase, "To the victor belong the spoils." Supporters called it democratic house cleaning, sweeping out entrenched office holders. Critics called it the birth of institutionalized cronyism in American government, and in some ways they were both right. And our 15th secret returns us to Rachel Jackson, the woman whose grief may have shaped Jackson's temperament more than any policy fight of his presidency. Years before he became president, Jackson married Rachel while her divorce from her first husband had not yet, in fact, been legally finalized, a detail neither of them fully understood at the time. Once discovered, it meant that, for a period, they were technically committing bigamy, and their marriage had to be quietly redone once the divorce was properly settled. It should have faded into a minor, forgivable mistake of frontier paperwork. Instead, during the brutal 1828 campaign, Jackson's opponents dredged it up and used it mercilessly, branding Rachel an adulteress in the press. Rachel, in poor health already, saw the attacks in the weeks before the election and died suddenly just after Jackson won the presidency, before he ever took office. Jackson never forgave his political enemies for it, and he is said to have blamed the campaign, for the rest of his life, for hastening her death. 15 secrets in, and the country was about to stumble rather badly into an economic collapse under Jackson's handpicked successor, Martin Van Buren, whose presidency would be consumed almost entirely by the Panic of 1837. But an even stranger constitutional puzzle was waiting just beyond it, one that had never been tested before. What happens when a president dies in office, and no one is quite sure what his vice president actually becomes? That puzzle arrived in April of 1841, and it gives us secret number 16. William Henry Harrison, the 9th president, died just 31 days into his term, and suddenly the country found itself somewhere the Constitution had never clearly gone before. Vice President John Tyler believed he had simply become the president, full stop, with every power the office carried. But a good many people in Congress, and even some members of his own cabinet, disagreed. They argued Tyler was merely an acting president, a caretaker holding the seat until a new election could be called, not a president in the full constitutional sense. Tyler did not wait for anyone's permission. He took the oath, moved into the White House, and began signing legislation as though the matter were beyond debate. It worked in the sense that the precedent held, and it would eventually be written formally into the Constitution more than a century later, through the 25th Amendment. But Tyler paid a price of his own for his boldness. His own party, the Whigs, grew so alienated by his politics that they formally expelled him from the party while he was still sitting in the Oval Office, an almost unimaginable rebuke, leaving him to finish his term essentially without a party at all. History remembers him, not always kindly, by the nickname his critics gave him, his accidency. Secret number 17 follows Tyler into the very last stretch of his presidency, and into the question of Texas. Tyler wanted badly to bring the Republic of Texas into the Union, in part because it would add another slave-holding state to the country's balance of power. A formal treaty of annexation, though, needed a two-thirds vote in the Senate, and Tyler couldn't get it. So he and his allies reached for an unusual tool instead, a joint resolution of Congress, which required only a simple majority in both chambers rather than the Senate supermajority a treaty demanded. Critics called it a naked constitutional workaround, a way of doing through the back door what couldn't be done through the front. It worked. Texas was annexed in the final days of Tyler's term, just before he left office, setting the stage for a war with Mexico that his successor would soon be fighting. That successor was James K. Polk, and secret number 18 concerns the very origins of that war. In the spring of 1846, Polk told Congress that Mexican troops had crossed into American territory and shed American blood upon American soil, and he used that language to secure a declaration of war. The trouble was the exact location of that clash sat inside a strip of land whose ownership was itself disputed between the United States and Mexico, land Mexico had never agreed was American at all. A young, largely unknown congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln rose in the House and challenged Polk directly, demanding the president identify the precise spot, the exact ground, where American blood had supposedly been shed on undisputed American soil. Lincoln's demands became known as the Spot Resolutions, and Polk never really answered them to anyone's satisfaction. Whether Polk manufactured a pretext for a war he wanted anyway, or whether he genuinely believed the disputed territory was rightfully American, remains one of the enduring unresolved questions of his presidency. Secret number 19 takes us to the brief, unfinished presidency of Zachary Taylor, and to a scandal quietly unfolding inside his own cabinet even as he served. The Galphin family held a claim against the federal government stretching back decades, over debt owed to their ancestor from long before the Revolution. In 1850, Taylor's Treasury Secretary, William Meredith, and his Secretary of War, George Crawford, approved payment on that claim, including a staggering interest sum, something in the neighborhood of $100,000, an enormous fortune for the era. What made it a scandal, rather than simple bureaucratic housekeeping, was this: George Crawford had, before joining the cabinet, personally represented the Galphin family as their private attorney, and under that old arrangement, he stood to collect roughly half of whatever the government paid out. A cabinet secretary had, in effect, approved a payment that quietly filled his own pocket. A congressional investigation that followed found no proof of outright criminal fraud, but it condemned the arrangement as a glaring conflict of interest all the same, and Crawford resigned from the cabinet under the weight of it. And that brings us, gently, to secret number 20, and to Millard Fillmore, the man who inherited the presidency after Taylor's sudden death in 1850. This one too deserves to be told honestly and without flinching, because it shaped real lives. As part of the Compromise of 1850, meant to hold the fracturing country together, Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act, and he did not merely sign it quietly. He enforced it aggressively, using federal power to compel ordinary citizens in free northern states to assist in capturing and returning people who had escaped slavery under real legal penalty if they refused to help. For abolitionists and for many ordinary Northerners who had never given slavery much thought before, the law was a profound shock. It reached into free states and demanded their direct participation in an institution many of them found morally unbearable, turning private conscience into a matter of federal law enforcement. It bought the Union perhaps a decade of fragile peace. It also deepened the very divisions it was meant to paper over, and it remains one of the most consequential and most troubling decisions of Fillmore's short and largely forgotten presidency. 20 secrets behind us now, and the Union is beginning to strain in ways that can no longer be smoothed over by compromise alone. Ahead lies a decade sliding steadily toward the edge, and a quiet, little-remembered man named Franklin Pierce is about to inherit it. The country's temperature kept rising, and it fell to the next president to try to lower it. Franklin Pierce arrived in the White House in 1853, carrying a grief most of us can barely imagine. Weeks before his inauguration, he and his wife Jane watched their 11-year-old son die in a train accident, the third child they had lost. Jane Pierce would spend much of her time in the White House writing letters to the boy, and some historians have gently wondered whether that sorrow left her husband without the strength the moment demanded. Because the moment, it turns out, demanded quite a lot. Settle in for secret number 21, and let it carry you across the Atlantic to a quiet Belgian coastal town called Ostend. In October of 1854, 3 of Pierce's own diplomats, his ministers to Britain, France, and Spain, met there in secret to talk about Cuba. The United States wanted the island badly, mostly because Southern interests wanted more slave territory to balance the growing free states, and these 3 men drafted a private dispatch arguing that America should try to buy Cuba from Spain, and if Spain refused to sell, the dispatch suggested, the United States would be justified in simply taking it by force. That document became known as the Ostend Manifesto, and when a newspaper leaked its contents, the reaction was immediate and furious. European governments were appalled that American diplomats had casually proposed armed conquest of a sovereign colony. Northern newspapers were appalled for a different reason. They saw it, correctly, as a scheme to expand slavery's reach. Congress denounced it, Pierce was forced to quietly disown it, and the whole episode became a lasting embarrassment, a reminder of just how much of American foreign policy in this era was being pulled by the gravity of the slavery question. And that same gravity pulled harder at home. Our next secret, number 22, is the one many historians consider the single most consequential piece of legislation of the entire decade. In 1854, Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a law that let the settlers of 2 new territories decide for themselves, by popular vote, whether slavery would be legal there. It sounds almost reasonable, framed that way. Let the people choose. But here's the thing worth remembering. It quietly erased a boundary that had kept the peace for over 30 years, the line drawn by the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had simply forbidden slavery north of a certain latitude. Wiping that line away meant that Kansas, sitting well north of it, was suddenly up for grabs. Pro-slavery settlers poured in from Missouri. Anti-slavery settlers poured in from New England, and both sides armed themselves. What followed became known, chillingly, as Bleeding Kansas. Years of raids, burned towns, and killings between the 2 factions. A small, brutal preview of the war that was still 6 years away. Pierce's presidency never really recovered from it, and his own party declined to renominate him. He remains the only elected president in American history denied a second nomination by his own party. His successor, James Buchanan, brings us to secret number 23, and this one asks for a bit of gentleness as we tell it. Buchanan remains the only president in American history who never married, and for more than a decade before he took office, he shared a Washington residence with Senator and later Vice President William Rufus King of Alabama. The 2 men were inseparable in the capital's social life, arriving together at events so consistently that contemporaries gave them mocking nicknames playing on their closeness, and in his own letters, King referred to himself half-jokingly as Buchanan's wife. What exactly that friendship meant to the 2 men privately is something no surviving letter or diary settles definitively, and serious historians remain genuinely divided on the question. We simply don't have the kind of evidence that would let anyone speak with certainty about it, and it deserves to be left there, as an open question, not a punchline. What is certain is that Buchanan's presidency struggled badly with the same crisis Pierce had failed to solve, which brings us to secret 24. In 1857, a pro-slavery faction in Kansas produced a proposed state constitution at a convention in the town of Lecompton, and then arranged a ratification vote so lopsided in its design that anti-slavery Kansans largely boycotted it rather than participate in what they saw as a rigged process. Buchanan threw the full weight of his presidency behind accepting this Lecompton Constitution anyway, pressuring Congress hard to admit Kansas as a slave state on the strength of a vote almost nobody trusted. The scheme ultimately collapsed. Kansas would eventually enter the Union free, but the fight over it tore Buchanan's own Democratic Party into northern and southern wings that would never fully heal, a split that would matter enormously in the election of 1860. And that brings us, quietly and heavily, to Secret 25. After Abraham Lincoln won that election in November of 1860, there were 4 long months before his inauguration in March. And during that entire stretch, still holding the office, Buchanan largely stood by as one southern state after another declared its secession from the Union. Federal forts and arsenals across the South were seized by state militias with little resistance. Buchanan believed secession was illegal, but he also believed, by his own reading of the Constitution, that the federal government had no clear power to stop a state from leaving. That legal paralysis, whatever its reasoning, is judged by most historians today as one of the most consequential failures of leadership any American president has ever shown. 4 wasted months in which the crisis was allowed to harden past the point of peaceful return. By the time Buchanan finally left office, the Union he had sworn to preserve was already coming apart in his hands, and the man arriving to inherit that fractured house was Abraham Lincoln. By the time Buchanan finally left office, the Union he had sworn to preserve was already coming apart in his hands, and the man arriving to inherit that fractured house was Abraham Lincoln. You know the broad strokes of what came next, the war, the grief, the eventual triumph and tragedy of it all. But even inside the Lincoln White House, in the middle of the greatest crisis the nation had ever faced, there were quieter scandals unfolding, and it's worth slowing down for them now. Secret number 26 belongs to Mary Todd Lincoln, and it's a story about money and about grief that curdled into something like obsession. Congress had given the First Lady a budget to refurbish a White House that had genuinely fallen into disrepair, and Mary threw herself into the project with real energy, buying French wallpaper, imported china, elaborate draperies. The trouble was she kept buying long after the budget ran out, quietly overspending it by tens of thousands of dollars, an enormous sum at the time, and then scrambling behind the scenes to cover the shortfall, at one point even soliciting favors and patronage arrangements to help settle the debts before her husband found out. When Lincoln did find out, in the middle of a war that was asking ordinary families to sacrifice everything, he was reportedly furious, calling it flatly wrong that public money should be spent so lavishly on carpets while soldiers went without proper blankets. Mary's spending, layered on top of the grief that would soon deepen after the death of their young son Willie in 1862, has left historians with a portrait of a woman under genuinely enormous strain, acting out in ways the country was in no mood to forgive. Here's the thing worth remembering about Lincoln himself, and it's secret number 27. The same president remembered today for eloquence and restraint also made one of the boldest, most disputed uses of executive power in American history. In 1861, with Confederate sympathizers sabotaging rail lines between Washington and the North, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, the ancient legal principle that the government must justify to a court why it is holding someone. Suspending it meant the military could arrest and detain civilians suspected of disloyalty without ever bringing formal charges. One Maryland man, John Merryman, was arrested this way, and his case went to none other than Chief Justice Roger Taney, who ruled from the bench that only Congress, not the president alone, had the constitutional authority to suspend habeas corpus. Lincoln simply ignored the ruling and kept the suspension in place, arguing that preserving the Union as a whole justified bending, in this one narrow respect, the very document he had sworn to defend. Congress eventually passed legislation of its own authorizing what Lincoln had already done, but the underlying question, how much power a president may seize unilaterally in a national emergency, is still debated by legal scholars today. We move now into darker territory, to the spring of 1865, and secret number 28. On March 4th, at his own inauguration as Vice President, Andrew Johnson stood to deliver remarks to the Senate chamber, and instead delivered what remains, to this day, the most notorious inaugural address in American history. Johnson had been fighting typhoid fever, and by most accounts took whiskey beforehand simply to steady himself enough to get through the ceremony. Whatever the cause, what followed was a rambling, repetitive, at times nearly incoherent speech that ran on far too long, embarrassing everyone in the room. Lincoln included, who was seen quietly asking that the ceremony move along. It was a strange, uncomfortable footnote to a day that only weeks later would take on an entirely different weight. Once Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson found himself, unexpectedly and almost overnight, the president of a nation still trying to figure out how to become whole again. That unsteady beginning set the tone for what followed, and it brings us to Secret 29. Johnson's presidency collided head-on with a Congress that deeply distrusted him, and in 1868 that distrust boiled over. When Johnson tried to remove his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, in apparent violation of a law called the Tenure of Office Act, the House of Representatives voted to impeach him, making Johnson the first president in American history to face a Senate trial for removal from office. The vote in the Senate came down to a single ballot. Had just one more senator voted to convict, Johnson would have been removed. He survived by that single vote, remaining in office for the rest of his term, though deeply weakened and largely unable to shape the peace that followed the war. And that peace, or the failure to build one, is where we land for Secret Number 30, a story that deserves to be told with real weight. In the war's final months, General William Tecumseh Sherman had issued Special Field Order 15, setting aside coastal land in Georgia and South Carolina to be redistributed to formerly enslaved families, the origin of the phrase 40 acres and a mule. It offered, for a brief window, a genuine foothold toward independence for people who had owned nothing their whole lives. Johnson reversed it. Alongside that reversal, he issued sweeping pardons to former Confederate officials and generously restored their property, undoing much of what little redistribution had begun, and allowing many of the same men who had led the rebellion to return to political power in the South. For the families who had briefly held title to land of their own, watching it handed back to former Confederate landowners, the loss was profound, and its consequences would echo through the decades of hardship that followed. It stands today as one of the clearest turning points where Reconstruction's promise narrowed sharply, long before it would end altogether. Johnson would leave office in 1869 without ever winning a term of his own, and the country turned instead to the general who had led the Union to victory, a man named Ulysses S. Grant. Johnson would leave office in 1869 without ever winning a term of his own, and the country turned instead to the general who had led the Union to victory, a man named Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was, by nearly every account, personally honest almost to a fault. But he trusted people too easily, and his 8 years in office became, fairly or not, a byword for the kind of corruption that flourishes around a good man who simply doesn't want to believe the worst about his friends. Let that settle for a moment as we reach Secret Number 31, which actually began before Grant even took office, though it wouldn't come fully to light until 1872, well into his presidency. A construction company called Credit Mobilier had been quietly skimming enormous profits by overcharging the Union Pacific Railroad for the very tracks it was laying, tracks being built with the help of generous federal subsidies. To keep Congress from asking uncomfortable questions, the company's insiders handed out cash and deeply discounted shares of stock to sitting congressmen, a bribe dressed up as an investment opportunity. When a newspaper finally exposed the scheme, the list of names attached to it was staggering, and it reached all the way up to Grant's own vice president, Schuyler Colfax, who was implicated so thoroughly that he was quietly dropped from the ticket for Grant's second term. The scandal didn't touch Grant personally, but it happened on his watch, among men he'd trusted, and that pattern would repeat itself again and again. It had actually started earlier than that, though, and Secret Number 32 takes us back to September of 1869, just months into Grant's first term, for an episode known as Black Friday. Two financiers, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, hatched a scheme to corner the market on gold, and to make it work, they needed the federal government to simply stay out of the way and not sell any of its own gold reserves. So they cultivated a relationship with a man who had close access to the president, Grant's own brother-in-law, Abel Corbin, hoping Corbin could quietly influence Grant's thinking. For a while it seemed to work. Gold prices climbed and climbed as speculation mounted. But once Grant realized what was happening, he acted decisively, ordering the Treasury to sell a substantial amount of government gold onto the open market. The price collapsed almost instantly, wiping out fortunes in a single afternoon and triggering a broader financial panic that rippled through the American economy for months. Grant hadn't been part of the scheme, but the fact that the schemers had gotten close enough to try, through his own family, unsettled the public all the same. Secret number 33 carries us into 1875, and a conspiracy that reached even closer to home. A network of whiskey distillers and the Treasury agents meant to be overseeing them had spent years secretly defrauding the federal government of liquor taxes, more than $4 million worth, some of that money quietly funneled toward Grant's own re-election efforts. The ring's operations were eventually exposed, and the investigation reached all the way to Grant's own private secretary and close friend, Orville Babcock, who was indicted for his role in it. In an extraordinary moment, Grant himself gave a sworn deposition on Babcock's behalf, becoming the first sitting president in American history to testify, even indirectly, for a criminal defendant. Babcock was acquitted, though many historians believe Grant's loyalty to his old friend blinded him to evidence that should have troubled him. By the time prosecutors finished pursuing the ring more broadly, over 110 convictions had been secured, a startling number for a scandal that had operated for years, right under the government's nose. If that weren't enough, secret number 34 brings us to 1876, Grant's final year in office, and to his Secretary of War, William Belknap. Belknap had been quietly accepting bribes, more than $40,000 over several years, in exchange for controlling who received a lucrative and exclusive license to run a trading post at Fort Sill in Indian Territory. When the scheme finally surfaced, Belknap rushed to the White House and resigned just minutes before the House of Representatives voted to impeach him. The House impeached him anyway, arguing his resignation shouldn't let him escape accountability, but when the case reached the Senate, enough senators believed that a resigned official was no longer within their jurisdiction to convict, and Belknap was acquitted on that technical ground alone, even though few of those senators seriously doubted his guilt. And so, after 2 terms defined by scandals that swirled around him without ever quite touching him personally, Grant stepped aside, and the country turned to the disputed election of 1876, our final secret in this stretch, number 35. Rutherford B. Hayes ran against Samuel Tilden, who won more of the popular vote, and for a tense stretch that winter, nobody could say for certain who had actually won, as returns from several southern states came back disputed and contested. To settle it, Congress created a special electoral commission, and behind closed doors, a quiet political bargain took shape, one that would echo for generations. In exchange for the disputed electoral votes being awarded to Hayes along strict party lines, Republican leaders agreed to withdraw the last federal troops still stationed in the South, troops that had been protecting the fragile gains of Reconstruction. The peaceful transfer of power that followed came at a steep and lasting cost. Without federal protection, Southern state governments moved quickly to strip away the rights Black Americans had only recently gained, laying the groundwork for the Jim Crow era that would grip the region for the better part of a century. Some newspapers of the era took to calling Hayes Ruther Fraud, a nickname that has followed him into the history books ever since. Grant's scandals and the bargain that ended Reconstruction closed out one long, difficult chapter of the American story. The next one would open with an assassin's bullet and a president named James Garfield who barely had time to begin. James Garfield had been in the White House only a few months when he found himself staring down a scandal that had been quietly rotting the post office for years, and it's worth slowing down here, because secret number 36 is one of those stories that shows you how old some forms of corruption really are. It was called the Star Route Scandal, and it involved something almost sleepy in name only: the contracts the government awarded for carrying mail along remote rural routes, the ones marked with a little star in the postal ledgers to indicate they needed a private carrier rather than a railroad. Whoever won those contracts could bid low to secure them, and then quietly get the terms padded and repadded until the government was paying far more than the job required. By 1881, investigators were circling a former congressman and a ring of senior postal officials who had turned this sleepy corner of government into a very lucrative one. Garfield, to his credit, pushed his administration to dig into it rather than look away. But he would never see where the investigation led. In July of that year, just months into his term, he was shot by a disappointed office seeker, and after weeks of decline, he died. The Star Route prosecutions, remarkably, did not die with him. They fell instead to his vice president, Chester Arthur, and here is where the story turns strange in a very human way. Close your eyes and picture it. A man who had spent his entire career as a beneficiary of the very patronage system Garfield's investigators were unraveling. A man of the so-called stalwart faction who owed his rise to exactly the kind of backroom favor trading the Star Route scheme represented. And there is a second, quieter secret about Arthur, one that unfolded almost entirely out of public view. About a year into his presidency, doctors diagnosed him with Bright's disease, a kidney ailment that in the 1880s was considered close to a death sentence. This is secret number 37, and historians still debate exactly how much Arthur himself understood about his prognosis, since the full extent of what he was told was never made public. What we do know is that his office denied the illness outright, telling the press and the public that his occasional bouts of poor health were nothing more than a stubborn case of malaria. The concealment worked. It worked so well that most Americans had no real sense of how sick their president was until well after he left office, when the truth became impossible to keep quiet any longer. And yet, here's the thing worth remembering about Chester Arthur. Knowing he was dying seems to have freed him, rather than making him cautious. That's secret number 38. Instead of protecting the patronage machine that had made him, Arthur let the Star Route prosecutions continue, even though many of the men implicated were his own old allies. And in 1883, he signed the Pendleton Civil Service Act, a law that began replacing political favoritism in government hiring with a merit-based exam system. It was such a dramatic reversal of everything Arthur had represented for most of his career that even the reformers who had once mocked him were startled. He would not seek a second term. His health quietly would not have allowed it. The presidency then passed to Grover Cleveland, a bachelor from Buffalo whose personal life became the subject of one of the more uncomfortable chapters of the 1884 campaign. This is secret number 39, and it deserves to be told with some care, because the full truth of it was never entirely settled even at the time. Years earlier, Cleveland had been involved with a widow named Maria Halpin, who in 1874 gave birth to a son, whom she named Oscar Folsom Cleveland. Cleveland acknowledged financial responsibility for the boy and arranged for his care. Even though the question of paternity was genuinely murky, Halpin, it turned out, had other relationships around that time as well, including, uncomfortably, with Cleveland's own law partner, a man named Oscar Folsom. When the story broke publicly during the campaign, Cleveland's opponents seized on it, and crowds took up a taunting little chant that would follow him for the rest of his political life. Ma, where's my pa? Cleveland's advisors urged him to simply tell the truth about the whole affair, rather than deny it, and he did, which by the standards of the era was its own kind of quiet integrity. He won the election anyway, and after his defeat and chant died down somewhat, supporters supposedly answered back with their own rhyme, once he reached the White House. Gone to the White House, ha ha ha. Cleveland's presidency held one more secret, and it may be the most remarkable one in this stretch of American history, so settle in for secret number 40. In the summer of 1893, the country was sliding into a severe financial depression, and Cleveland, ever wary of anything that might rattle the fragile markets further, discovered a small cancerous tumor in the roof of his mouth. Rather than let the news reach the public, he arranged something almost unbelievable, a secret surgery performed not in a hospital, but aboard a friend's private yacht, the Oneida, as it sailed quietly along the East River and out into Long Island Sound. Over roughly 90 minutes, a team of surgeons removed the tumor along with a portion of his upper jaw, all while the ship stayed far enough from shore that no one on land would notice anything unusual. Cleveland recovered with a specially fitted rubber prosthesis that let him speak and appear publicly with barely a change in his voice. When a newspaper reporter later got wind of the truth and published it, the White House denied the story so thoroughly and so convincingly that the reporter's career was nearly ruined over it. It would be years, decades, really, before one of the surgeons finally confirmed, after Cleveland's death, that every word the reporter had written was true. As the 1890s gave way to a new century, the presidency was about to pass to a quiet man from Ohio named William McKinley. And with him, America was about to be pulled toward a war that began under circumstances far murkier than the newspapers of the day ever let on. William McKinley did not want a war. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because secret number 41 is really a story about how little control even a president can have once a nation's newspapers decide what story they want to tell. In February of 1898, the American battleship USS Maine exploded while anchored in Havana Harbor, killing more than 200 sailors. Nobody at the time could say with any certainty what had caused it. But certain newspapers, locked in a fierce circulation war and prone to what became known as yellow journalism, didn't wait for certainty. They ran headline after headline blaming Spanish sabotage, whipping up public fury until "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry heard across the country. McKinley, by most accounts a cautious and reluctant man when it came to war, found himself swept along by a wave of public opinion he had not created and could barely resist. The United States went to war with Spain that April. And here's the quiet, unsettling coda to the story. Naval investigations conducted decades later, in 1911 and again in 1976, both suggested that the explosion was more likely caused by a fire in the ship's coal bunkers igniting nearby ammunition, an internal accident, not an act of sabotage at all. The war that reshaped America's role in the world may have begun with a tragedy that was never anyone's fault to begin with. When McKinley was assassinated in 1901, the presidency passed to a young, restless vice president named Theodore Roosevelt, and it did not take him long to write his own chapter into this list. This is secret number 42, and it concerns the Panama Canal. Roosevelt wanted a canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific, and the most direct route ran through a province of Columbia. When Columbia's Senate balked at the terms the United States offered and rejected the treaty, Roosevelt did not simply walk away and negotiate again. Instead, his administration quietly supported a Panamanian independence movement that had been simmering for years, and when the uprising began, American warships moved into position to block Colombian troops from reaching the province to put it down. Within days, Panama declared independence, and the United States recognized the new nation almost immediately, securing exactly the canal rights it had wanted all along. Roosevelt himself, never a man for false modesty, later told an audience quite plainly, "I took the isthmus." Not everyone found that boast admirable. Even at the time, contemporaries, including the editorial pages of the New York Times, described the whole affair as an act of what they called sordid conquest. There is a darker episode from the Roosevelt years, one that deserves to be told honestly and without softening, because softening it would do a disservice to the men it harmed. This is secret number 43, the Brownsville Affair. In August of 1906, a shooting in Brownsville, Texas left one man dead, and suspicion fell immediately on soldiers of the all-black 25th Infantry Regiment stationed nearby. No individual soldier was ever identified as responsible, and no one was ever convicted of anything in a courtroom. And yet Roosevelt, acting on the collective accusation alone, ordered the dishonorable discharge of 167 soldiers, stripping them of their pensions and their years of honorable service without so much as a trial. It was, even by the standards of its own time, widely condemned as an act of racial injustice dressed up as military discipline. The decision stood unchanged for 66 years, until the Army finally reversed it in 1972, restoring honorable discharges to men who by then were almost entirely gone, save for a single survivor. Roosevelt's handpicked successor, William Howard Taft, inherited a Republican Party that looked unified but was already beginning to crack, and secret number 44 explains a good deal of why. It's known as the Ballinger-Pinchot Affair. Taft's Interior Secretary, Richard Ballinger, was accused of favoring private corporate interests in the disposition of coal-rich lands in Alaska, land that conservationists believe should have stayed in public hands. The accusation came from a man named Gifford Pinchot, the nation's chief forester and a close ally and friend of Theodore Roosevelt, who had built his career on exactly the kind of conservation Ballinger seemed willing to compromise. When Pinchot took his accusations public, criticizing Ballinger openly, Taft responded by firing Pinchot for insubordination rather than removing Ballinger. A congressional panel later cleared Ballinger of the worst charges against him. But by then, the damage to Taft's presidency was already done. The rift between Taft's wing of the party and Roosevelt's old progressive allies never healed, and it would help drive Roosevelt to challenge his own former friend for the Republican nomination in 1912, splitting the party and handing the presidency to a Democrat for the first time in 16 years. That Democrat was Woodrow Wilson, and secret number 45 is one that history has not always told plainly, though it deserves to be. Wilson's administration, Upon taking office in 1913, reversed decades of integrated federal employment in Washington. Restrooms, cafeterias, and workspaces that black and white federal employees had shared since Reconstruction were quietly separated by administration order. Some agencies began requiring photographs on civil service applications, a change that allowed hiring officials to screen out black applicants who might otherwise have qualified on merit alone. It was, in plain terms, a deliberate rollback of gains that had taken half a century to secure, carried out through the ordinary machinery of federal administration rather than through any dramatic public announcement. Black leaders and newspapers of the era protested it directly to Wilson, who largely defended the changes as a matter of administrative harmony. Wilson would go on to lead the country through the First World War, and to help shape the peace that followed it. But the toll that effort took on his own body would soon become the most carefully guarded secret of his entire presidency. On October 1919, Woodrow Wilson suffered a massive stroke that left the left side of his body paralyzed and left him blind in one eye. And what happened next, secret number 46, is one of the strangest and least talked about episodes in the entire history of the American presidency. For the remaining year and a half of his term, it was not really Wilson who was running the country, at least not in any hands-on sense. It was his wife, Edith Wilson, who took it upon herself to control every piece of access to the president. She decided which documents reached his bedside and which did not. She decided which visitors, which cabinet members, which senators were allowed to see him, and for how long. She screened his mail, and by many accounts, made decisions in his name that he was never fully lucid enough to have made himself. Meanwhile, the public, the Congress, and even most of Wilson's own cabinet were told only that the president was resting and recovering, with the true severity of his condition kept carefully hidden. Historians have come to call this quiet arrangement Edith Wilson's stewardship, and it remains to this day one of the closest things America has ever had to an unelected, unconstitutional presidency operating in plain sight, hidden only by the closed doors of the White House residence. By the time Wilson's term ended in 1921, the country was ready for something calmer, and it got Warren Harding, a genial, popular Ohio senator who promised what he called a return to normalcy. What Americans got instead, in time, was one of the most corrupt administrations in the nation's history, and secret number 47 is the one that gave an entire category of American scandal its name for decades afterward: Teapot Dome. Harding's Interior Secretary, Albert Fall, had been quietly granted control over Navy petroleum reserves, oil fields set aside specifically to fuel the Navy in case of war, located at Teapot Dome in Wyoming and Elk Hills in California. Rather than protect those reserves, Fall secretly leased them to private oil executives, friends of his, without competitive bidding, in exchange for what investigators eventually traced to roughly $500,000 in bribes and so-called personal loans. When the arrangement finally came to light, it triggered years of congressional investigation and courtroom battles. By 1929, Albert Fall became the first cabinet secretary in American history convicted of a crime committed while in office, and he served just under a year in prison for it, quietly closing out a scandal that had taken most of a decade to unwind. Harding's personal life held secrets of its own, ones that would not be fully confirmed for nearly a century. This is secret number 48. A young woman named Nan Britton, who had known Harding since she was a teenager and later became his mistress, gave birth to a daughter she named Elizabeth Ann and always insisted was Harding's child, conceived while he was still a sitting senator. In 1927, 4 years after Harding's death, Britton published a best-selling memoir laying out the whole relationship in detail, and it scandalized the country. For decades afterward, most historians and much of the public simply didn't believe her, dismissing the book as either fabrication or exaggeration, in part because the Harding family and his political allies worked hard to discredit her. Britton would not live to see herself vindicated. In 2015, DNA testing conducted on living descendants of both Harding and Britton confirmed, with 99.9% certainty, that Elizabeth Ann had indeed been Warren Harding's daughter all along. Nan Britton was not the only woman in Harding's life outside his marriage, and secret number 49 belongs to a much longer, quieter relationship. For roughly 15 years, spanning the period both before and during his presidency, Harding carried on an affair with Carrie Phillips, the wife of one of his own friends back in Ohio. The two exchanged hundreds of pages of letters over the years, many of them strikingly explicit for their era, and after Harding's death, his family and estate went to considerable lengths to keep those letters out of public view, eventually reaching a legal settlement that sealed them away for decades. It was not until 2014, nearly a century after they were written, that the letters were finally published in full, offering historians an unusually intimate and unfiltered window into a president's private life. And then there was the circle of friends and Ohio political allies Harding brought with him to Washington, a group so notorious it earned its own nickname, the Ohio Gang. This is secret number 50, and it's the one that finally caught up with Harding's presidency all at once. Charles Forbes, whom Harding appointed to run the newly created Veterans Bureau, was found to have defrauded the agency of tens of millions of dollars meant for the care of disabled and wounded veterans, funneling contracts to favorite suppliers and pocketing the difference. As investigators closed in on the wider network of corruption surrounding Harding's inner circle, a Justice Department official named Jess Smith, deeply entangled in the same web of bribery, took his own life in the spring of 1923, just weeks before Harding himself would be gone too. Because that summer, on a trip out west meant to put some distance between himself and the scandals closing in around Washington, Warren Harding would die suddenly and unexpectedly in a San Francisco hotel room, and what exactly killed him, in the absence of an autopsy, is a question that has never fully been laid to rest. We left Warren Harding surrounded by the wreckage of his own administration, the Ohio Gang scattering, Albert Falls oil leases about to detonate into the biggest scandal Washington had seen, and the president himself, by the summer of 1923, looking exhausted in a way that worried the people closest to him. He set out that June on what he called a voyage of understanding, a cross-country and Alaska tour meant to put some distance between himself and the Capitol, and to let the American people see him as something other than the man whose friends were about to be indicted. He never made it home. Secret number 51 settles on the strange, still debated circumstances of Harding's death. In San Francisco, at the Palace Hotel, on the evening of August 2, 1923, Warren Harding died suddenly, officially of a heart attack, brought on, doctors said, by a combination of cardiovascular disease and the strain of the trip. But here's the thing worth sitting with for a moment. His wife, Florence Harding, refused to allow an autopsy. No post-mortem examination was ever performed, and into that silence rushed rumor that the First Lady herself had poisoned him. Weary of his affairs and fearful of the scandals about to break over his name, that political enemies had gotten to him, that the Ohio Gang had reason to want him silenced before he could testify to what he knew. None of it has ever been substantiated. Not one shred of physical evidence supports poisoning, and the great majority of historians, weighing the medical accounts of the time against Harding's documented heart trouble, accept the heart attack as the real cause. But because the one test that could have settled the question forever was never run, the rumor has never fully died either. It's the kind of mystery history simply has to leave open. Which brings us, gently, to secret number 52, not a scandal at all, but a private grief so heavy it reshaped a presidency. Calvin Coolidge, who succeeded Harding, inherited a nation hungry for a return to quiet, unglamorous competence, and for a while he gave it to them. But in the summer of 1924, while Coolidge was running for a term of his own, his 16-year-old son, Calvin Jr., played tennis on the White House lawn without socks. A blister formed on his toe. The blister became infected, and within days, in an era before antibiotics existed to stop it, the infection turned to blood poisoning and the boy was dead. Coolidge later wrote, in words that still ache nearly a century later, that the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. Those who knew Coolidge before and after that summer described two different men, the same dry New England reserve, but deepened now into a detachment that had always been part of his character, yet after 1924 seemed to carry real sorrow underneath it. Not everything hidden behind the walls of the White House is a matter of corruption. Sometimes it is simply a family, grieving, in the most public house in the country. From private sorrow we move to public catastrophe. Secret number 53 takes us to the summer of 1932, deep into the Great Depression, when thousands of World War I veterans, many unemployed, many with families in tow, marched on Washington and set up camp near the Capitol. They called themselves the Bonus Army, and they had come to ask for something the government had promised them years earlier, early payment of a bonus for their wartime service, due in full only in 1945, but desperately needed now, in the depths of the crisis. President Herbert Hoover, unwilling to grant the early payment, eventually ordered the army to clear the veterans' camps. What followed went far beyond what Hoover had actually authorized. General Douglas MacArthur, convinced the marchers were dangerous radicals, led troops in with tanks, bayonets, and tear gas, burning the camps to the ground and exceeding his orders in the process. Men who had served their country a decade earlier were driven out of the capital by that same country's army. The images reached newspapers across the nation and did lasting damage to the veterans, to the country's conscience, and to Hoover's already fading hopes of re-election. That defeat, that fall, opened the door to secret number 54, one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the entire 20th century presidency. In 1921, more than a decade before he ever reached the White House, Franklin Delano Roosevelt contracted polio. He survived, but he was left paralyzed from the waist down, unable to stand or walk without heavy leg braces, canes, and the support of another person. And yet, across more than 12 years in the presidency, the longest tenure in American history, most Americans never fully saw it. The press corps of the era, in an arrangement almost unthinkable today, quietly agreed not to photograph Roosevelt in his wheelchair, or being carried, or struggling to move from car to podium. It wasn't a law or even a formal rule, simply an understanding, honored again and again, that let the nation see a president who appeared to stand tall through depression and war, while the man himself lived every day with a disability the public was never quite allowed to see clearly. And there is one more secret folded into Roosevelt's personal life, quieter still. Secret number 55 concerns Lucy Mercer, who worked as Eleanor Roosevelt's social secretary beginning in the late 19-teens. Around 1918, Franklin began an affair with her. Eleanor discovered the truth when she found a bundle of love letters, and by most accounts offered her husband a divorce. Franklin declined. A divorce would have ended his political future, and other pressures too, from his mother and from political allies, urged the marriage to hold together. Publicly, the Roosevelts remained married, partners in one of the defining presidencies in American history. But privately, Franklin kept in secret contact with Lucy Mercer for the rest of his life. She was there, in Warm Springs, Georgia, on the day in April 1945 when he died. Roosevelt's private world, though, is only half the story of those years. Beyond the White House walls, the nation was sliding toward the largest war the world had ever seen, and within that war, Roosevelt himself would soon make one of the most controversial decisions any American president has ever signed his name to. That decision came just weeks after Pearl Harbor, in the early fearful months of 1942, and it is secret number 56 on our list, and one of the hardest to sit with. On February 19th of that year, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the military to forcibly remove and intern any persons deemed a threat to national security from designated areas of the country. In practice, it was aimed almost entirely at one group, Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. Roughly 120,000 people were rounded up and sent to internment camps in remote parts of the country, stripped of their homes, their businesses, their belongings, often given only days to pack whatever they could carry. The great majority of them were American citizens. None were charged with a crime, none received a trial. There was no individualized finding of disloyalty against any of them, only their ancestry. It would take decades for the country to fully reckon with what had been done. In 1988, Congress formally apologized and authorized reparations to survivors, and the Justice Department itself, in later years, acknowledged that the internment had been a grave injustice, driven not by military necessity, but by wartime hysteria and racial prejudice. It remains one of the starkest reminders in this entire list that a president's wartime powers, even when framed as protection, can be turned against the very citizens they are meant to protect. Let's move gently into secret number 57 and the far murkier political roots of the man who would become president in the war's final year. Harry Truman's rise in politics did not begin in Washington. It began in Kansas City, under the patronage of Tom Pendergast, the boss of one of the most notoriously corrupt political machines in American history. The Pendergast machine controlled Kansas City through a potent mix of patronage, intimidation, and outright fraud, election workers who produced votes that didn't exist, ballot boxes stuffed for favored candidates, opponents who found it dangerous to campaign too loudly against the machine's chosen men. Truman owed his early career to that machine. It was Tom Pendergast himself who handpicked Truman to run for the United States Senate in 1934, and Truman, whatever his private discomfort with the machine's methods, accepted the backing and won. 4 years later, in 1938, Pendergast was convicted of tax evasion tied directly to the graft that had built his empire, and the machine collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Truman's own reputation survived largely untouched. Historians generally regard him as personally honest, even while benefiting from a thoroughly dishonest system, but the association with Pendergast trailed him for the rest of his career, a quiet reminder of how often the road to the presidency runs through arrangements a man might later prefer to forget. Secret number 58 carries us into the Korean War, and into one of the starkest confrontations between a president and a general in American history. General Douglas MacArthur, the same MacArthur who had led troops against the Bonus Army 2 decades earlier, commanded United Nations forces in Korea, and he was by 1951 arguably the most popular military figure in the country. But MacArthur wanted to expand the war, pushing publicly for strikes into China itself, an open contradiction of the Truman administration's policy of containing the conflict to the Korean peninsula. When MacArthur continued to air his disagreements publicly, defying direct instructions to clear his statements through Washington first, Truman made a decision that was entirely within his constitutional authority and yet almost unimaginably risky politically. He relieved MacArthur of command. The backlash was immediate and enormous. MacArthur returned home to ticker tape parades and talk, briefly, of a presidential run of his own, while Truman's approval ratings sank to some of the lowest ever recorded for a sitting president. And yet, looking back, most historians view the decision as a defining moment for the principle of civilian control over the American military, a principle Truman insisted on preserving, whatever the political cost to himself personally. From there we drift into quieter, more uncertain territory, secret number 59, which historians still cannot fully resolve. During the Second World War, General Dwight Eisenhower's personal driver and secretary was a young Irish woman named Kay Summersby, and for decades afterward, rumors persisted that the two had been romantically involved. Summersby herself, in a memoir published in 1948, denied any romance had taken place between them. But in 1975, after her death, a second memoir was published under her name, this one describing an emotional, unconsummated romantic relationship with Eisenhower during the war years. Eisenhower's family, his surviving wartime staff, and a number of historians have pushed back hard against the claims in that second book, questioning both its authorship and its accuracy. No letters, no witnesses, no definitive piece of evidence has ever settled the matter one way or the other. It remains, honestly, one of the more genuinely unresolved questions on this entire list. Not a confirmed scandal, but not a fully dismissed one either, and worth holding lightly rather than repeating as fact. And finally, as Eisenhower's presidency wound toward its close, secret number 60 brought a very public, very undisputed humiliation. In May of 1960, an American U-2 spy plane, flying reconnaissance deep over Soviet territory, was shot down. The Eisenhower administration, not yet realizing the pilot had survived, issued a cover story that a weather research aircraft had simply strayed off course. It was a story that fell apart within days, when the Soviet Union triumphantly produced the captured pilot, Francis Gary Powers, alive and in custody, along with the wreckage of his spy plane as proof. The diplomatic embarrassment was severe. A long-planned summit in Paris meant to ease Cold War tensions between Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev collapsed within days of opening, and Eisenhower left office not long after, with that failure still hanging over his final months. Eisenhower's presidency, and with it a certain post-war innocence, was ending. Waiting just beyond it was a young senator from Massachusetts, and an era that would come to be remembered, however imperfectly, as Camelot. Camelot is the word people still reach for when they describe the Kennedy White House. Young, glamorous, seemingly touched by an old Hollywood shine. And it's that shine that brings us to secret number 61, one of the most persistent rumors on this entire list, and one we should approach carefully. For decades, gossip has linked President Kennedy romantically to the actress Marilyn Monroe, a rumor fueled above all by one unforgettable moment: her breathless rendition of Happy Birthday, Mr. President at a Democratic fundraiser in May 1962, delivered in a shimmering, skin-tight gown to a president watching from the audience. It is documented that Kennedy and Monroe knew each other and that they had some direct contact, including at social gatherings connected to the Kennedy family. But a sustained, ongoing affair, of the kind whispered about for 60 years since, has never been proven. No letters, no reliable first-hand account free of later embellishment, no verified record establishes it as fact. Historians who study the Kennedy presidency closely tend to describe the relationship as unresolved at best, real contact, wrapped in decades of speculation that has often outpaced the evidence. It's worth carrying that distinction gently, rather than repeating the legend as though it were settled history. Secret number 62 takes us somewhere far more carefully hidden and far better documented: Kennedy's own health. Behind the image of vigor and youth that defined his public persona, Kennedy suffered from Addison's disease, a serious, potentially life-threatening disorder in which the adrenal glands fail to produce adequate hormones. His campaign, and later his White House, denied he had the condition at all, even as he quietly relied on steroid treatments to manage it and stay functioning. He also lived with severe chronic back pain, worsened by a wartime injury and by unrelated surgeries, and he received regular injections of painkillers and other medications simply to get through each day. None of this reached the public in any real detail while he was alive. The healthiest-looking president in a generation was, behind closed doors, one of the most medically fragile men ever to hold the office, a gap between image and reality that his team worked very hard, and very successfully, to keep hidden from the country he led. From concealed illness we turn to a very public failure. Secret number 63 is the Bay of Pigs, in April of 1961, barely 3 months into Kennedy's presidency. The CIA, with a plan developed under the Eisenhower administration and inherited by Kennedy on taking office, trained and armed a force of Cuban exiles to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs and spark a popular uprising against Fidel Castro. Kennedy approved the operation, though he limited the American air support behind it at the last moment. The invasion collapsed within 3 days, the exile force overwhelmed, more than 1,000 men captured, the expected uprising never materializing at all. It was a humiliating failure, and a clarifying one. Kennedy, to his credit, publicly took responsibility for the disaster rather than deflecting blame onto the CIA or his predecessor, famously remarking that victory has 100 fathers while defeat is an orphan. But it also left him wary, in ways that would matter enormously just 18 months later, when Cuba returned to the center of world events in a far more dangerous form. That danger is secret number 64. Tucked inside the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, 13 days that many historians still consider the closest the world has come to nuclear war. Publicly, the crisis ended with a straightforward trade. The Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its nuclear missiles from Cuba, and the United States publicly pledged not to invade the island. That was the story the world was told, and largely believed, for years afterward. But privately, there was a second part of the deal, one Kennedy insisted be kept secret, even from most of his own administration. In exchange for the Soviet withdrawal, the United States also agreed to remove its own Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey, stationed along the Soviet Union's southern border. Kennedy didn't want that concession made public, fearing it would make the resolution look like a weak trade rather than a firm stand against Moscow. So for years, the American public understood the crisis as a clean Soviet capitulation, never knowing that Washington had quietly given up something in return to bring the world back from the edge. And so we arrive at secret number 65, and the final months of 1963. Bobby Baker, a longtime protege of Lyndon Johnson's from his years as Senate Majority Leader, a man Johnson had personally mentored and relied on inside the chamber, resigned in the fall of 1963 amid a Senate investigation into bribery and influence peddling, including allegations that he had used contacts tied to organized crime to broker deals and steer government contracts. The scandal inevitably raised questions about Johnson himself, given how closely the two men's financial and political lives had been intertwined over the years. But before that thread could be fully pulled, the nation's attention shifted entirely. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One that same afternoon, and the political will to keep investigating the new president's old friend quietly and rather conveniently evaporated. Johnson would go on to win a full term of his own in 1964, in one of the largest landslides in American history. But even in that moment of triumph, he was already carrying another secret, a decision so consequential and so carefully hidden until the very end of his presidency that it would help reshape the election of 1968 before the country ever understood why. That hint about the secret Johnson carried out of the White House in 1968 wasn't idle. It was real, and it stayed hidden from the public for more than a quarter of a century. This is secret number 66, and it involves wiretaps, a foreign government, and an accusation that Johnson himself, in a private phone call, called treason. In the final weeks of the 1968 campaign, Johnson was pushing hard to bring North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the United States to the negotiating table in Paris, hoping a peace deal might still be reached before Americans voted. But every time progress seemed close, South Vietnam would suddenly grow cold and pull back. Suspicious, Johnson had the FBI place a Republican operative named Anna Chennault under physical surveillance and had the NSA intercept her communications with the South Vietnamese ambassador. The intercepts showed Chennault acting as a back channel for Nixon's campaign, quietly urging South Vietnam to stall, on the understanding that Nixon would offer better terms once elected. It worked. South Vietnam withdrew from the talks days before the election. Nixon narrowly defeated Hubert Humphrey, and the war ground on for years afterward. Johnson was furious. In a phone call with Senate Republican leader Everett Dirksen, a recording that survives to this day, he said plainly that what the Nixon campaign was doing amounted to treason. Yet he never said a word of it publicly, because the evidence had come from an illegal wiretap, and revealing it would have exposed how far his own administration had gone to spy on a rival campaign. The complete file on the Chennault affair stayed sealed until 1994, decades after nearly everyone involved, including Johnson himself, had died. To understand how Johnson ever came to hold that kind of war-making power in the first place, it helps to rewind a few years back to the very start of his presidency. This is secret number 67, and it concerns the incident that first handed Johnson broad authority to escalate the war in Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin incident of August 1964. Johnson told Congress and the public that North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked two American destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, not once but twice on two separate days. Congress responded almost unanimously, passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, handing Johnson sweeping authority to use military force in Southeast Asia, without ever asking for a formal declaration of war. Here's the trouble: the second attack, the one that turned an isolated skirmish into a mandate for full-scale war, appears never to have happened at all. Declassified NSA documents, released decades later, point to confused sonar readings and jumpy radar operators in stormy seas, rather than any actual enemy assault. Whether the administration knowingly exaggerated the incident or simply acted too quickly on faulty information is still debated today. What isn't debated is that a resolution passed in the confusion of a few tense days in August became the legal foundation for a war that would ultimately cost tens of thousands of American lives. Johnson chose not to seek re-election in 1968, worn down by the very war he had escalated, and the presidency passed to the man his own wiretaps had caught angling for it. Richard Nixon moved into the White House in January of 1969, and it would not be long before his own administration produced a secret that needed no illegal wiretap to uncover, because this time Nixon's own people did the wiretapping and got caught doing it. This is secret number 68, and by now it hardly needs an introduction, though it deserves to be told plainly. In the early morning hours of June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in a Washington office complex called the Watergate. They had broken in to plant listening devices and photograph documents, and police found cash and connections back to the committee to re-elect the president, Nixon's own re-election organization. At first, the White House brushed it off. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler called it a third-rate burglary. It was nothing of the kind. Investigative reporting, congressional hearings, and a special prosecutor's inquiry would spend the next 2 years pulling apart a much larger operation of espionage, sabotage, and cover-up reaching into the Oval Office itself, and it would end Nixon's presidency before his second term was through. One piece of evidence became, quite literally, a hole at the center of the whole affair. This is secret number 69. Among the White House tapes eventually subpoenaed was a recording made on June 20, 1972, 3 days after the break-in, of a conversation between Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. When investigators went to listen, they found that 18.5 minutes of it had been erased. Nixon's longtime secretary Rosemary Woods offered an explanation, demonstrating in a now-famous photograph an awkward stretch across her desk that she said might have let her foot slip onto the recorder's pedal while answering the phone, accidentally erasing part of the tape. But she only ever claimed responsibility for 4 or 5 minutes, not 18.5. And when a panel of independent audio experts examined the tape, they concluded the erasure had not happened in one continuous accidental sweep at all. It had been done deliberately in at least 5 separate segments, each requiring the recorder to be stopped and started by hand. What was actually said in those 18.5 minutes has never been recovered, and very likely never will be. By the autumn of 1973, with the tapes now the central battleground, Nixon made a move that shocked even seasoned Washington observers. This is secret number 70, known ever since as the Saturday Night Massacre. Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor appointed to investigate Watergate, had subpoenaed the White House tapes, and Nixon wanted him gone. On the night of October 20, 1973, he ordered his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned on the spot. Nixon then turned to the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, who also refused, and was fired for it. It was only the third man in that chain of command, Solicitor General Robert Bork, who finally agreed to carry out the order and dismissed Cox that night. For a few tense hours, it looked as though law enforcement itself was being dismantled from the top down, simply to protect one man from a set of tapes. The reaction was immediate and furious, and many historians still point to that night as the moment ordinary Americans, across party lines, began to believe Nixon had something worth resigning over. He did not resign that October, but the walls Nixon had spent a year building around himself were cracking now in full view of the country, and what came next would bring the whole structure down. Before Nixon's presidency finally gave way, the Watergate hearings pulled one more document into the light, and it told you almost everything you needed to know about how the White House had come to view the ordinary business of disagreement. This is secret number 71, the enemies list. White House counsel John Dean had helped compile a formal roster of political opponents, journalists, and public critics, along with a memo that explained, in language blunt enough to still startle people who read it today, that the administration intended to use, in Dean's own words, the available federal machinery to harass those on it. Names on the list and its later expanded versions included journalists who had written unflattering coverage, politicians who had crossed the White House, and even a handful of entertainers and academics who had spoken out publicly against the administration. The plan, as Dean described it, was to direct tax audits, federal investigations, and other forms of official scrutiny toward people whose only real offense was opposing Nixon or his policies. When the list surfaced during the Senate Watergate hearings in the summer of 1973, it did lasting damage to the idea that Nixon's troubles were limited to one break-in at one office building. It suggested something broader, an administration willing to turn the machinery of the federal government against its own critics. By the summer of 1974, that broader pattern, combined with the mounting weight of the tapes and the testimony, had left Nixon's presidency with almost nowhere left to go. This is secret number 72. Impeachment proceedings in the House had already produced 3 articles against him, and it was becoming clear, even to his own allies, that both the House and the Senate now had the votes to remove him from office. Rather than face that outcome, Nixon chose to resign. On August 9, 1974, he became the only president in American history to leave office before his term was complete, handing the presidency to his vice president, Gerald Ford, a man who had not even been elected to the office he was suddenly stepping into. And then, just a month later, on September 8, 1974, Ford did something that stunned the country all over again. He granted Nixon a full and unconditional pardon, covering any federal crimes Nixon might have committed during his time in office, before a single formal charge had ever been filed against him. Here is where the story grows more complicated, and it deserves to be told with the uncertainty it actually carries. This is secret number 73. Ford's pardon didn't just cover specific named offenses. It extended in its own careful legal language to crimes Nixon committed or may have committed while president, a phrase broad enough to close the door on any future prosecution before investigators had even finished their work. The pardon was met with immediate and widespread public anger. Many Americans and many members of Congress suspected it had been arranged in advance, some kind of quiet understanding traded for Nixon's willingness to step down peacefully rather than fight impeachment to the bitter end. No evidence has ever proven that such a deal existed, and Ford testified under oath before Congress, highly unusually for a sitting president, that no arrangement had been made. But the suspicion never fully faded, and the political cost was severe and lasting. Ford's approval ratings collapsed within days of the pardon, and many historians consider it the single decision most responsible for his narrow, and ultimately unsuccessful, run for a full term of his own in 1976. Jimmy Carter arrived in Washington in 1977 promising precisely the kind of clean break the Nixon and Ford years seemed to call for, a president who had never held federal office and owed nothing to the Capitol's old networks. It did not take long for that promise to be tested. This is secret number 74, the Burt Lance affair. Lance was Carter's director of the Office of Management and Budget, and just as importantly, one of his closest personal friends going back years in Georgia. Not long after joining the administration, Lance came under scrutiny for banking practices from before his federal service, including allegations involving overdrafts and questionable loans connected to a bank he had once run. A lengthy investigation followed, and in the end it found no evidence that any of it was connected to Carter's own campaign finances or conduct. But the process itself was damaging enough on its own. Lance resigned in September of 1977, and the episode quietly undercut the very image Carter had built his candidacy on, the idea that his administration would simply be different from the Washington insiders who came before it. The next embarrassment came from even closer to home, and it is worth telling gently, because it involves a man who was, by most accounts, struggling with problems of his own. This is secret number 75, sometimes remembered as Billygate. Billy Carter, the president's younger brother, had become something of a folk celebrity in his own right, known for a beer that bore his name and for public remarks that ranged from harmlessly colorful to genuinely offensive. Between 1978 and 1980, Billy accepted $220,000, described at the time as a loan, from the government of Libya, then led by Muammar Gaddafi, and he made a series of public statements sympathetic to the Libyan government while doing so. The arrangement triggered a formal Senate investigation, conducted on a bipartisan basis, into whether Billy had acted as an unregistered foreign agent or had improperly influenced his brother's foreign policy. The investigation ultimately found that Billy had broken no law, though it did conclude he should have registered his financial relationship with Libya more formally. No wrongdoing was ever traced back to the president himself, but arriving as it did in the middle of Carter's difficult 1980 re-election campaign, already strained by economic troubles and the Iran hostage crisis, the story did exactly what these things tend to do to a presidency already under pressure. It became one more headline the administration had to explain, at exactly the moment it could least afford to. Carter would lose that election in a landslide, and the country was about to turn toward a very different kind of presidency, one built on sunny optimism in public, and, as it would turn out, some very carefully guarded arrangements behind the scenes. Ronald Reagan took office in 1981 projecting an easy, sunny confidence that the country, worn down by the previous decade, seemed hungry for. But behind that confidence, in the middle years of his presidency, sat what remains one of the most tangled secrets on this entire list. This is secret number 76, the Iran-Contra affair. Beginning around 1985, senior officials within the Reagan administration secretly arranged to sell weapons to Iran, a country then under a strict American arms embargo, hoping the sales would help secure the release of American hostages being held by Iranian-backed groups in Lebanon. That alone would have been a serious controversy, but it was only half of what was actually happening. The profits from those secret arms sales were then quietly diverted to fund the Contra rebels fighting the government of Nicaragua, at a moment when Congress had explicitly banned exactly that kind of funding. When the scheme finally became public in late 1986, it exposed a shadow foreign policy operating almost entirely outside the oversight of Congress. National Security Advisor John Poindexter and his aide, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, were both convicted on charges connected to the affair, though their convictions were later overturned on appeal, largely because of complications tied to testimony they had given Congress under grants of immunity. Reagan himself was never personally charged with a crime, and he maintained that he had not known about the diversion of funds to the Contras, even as an official government review concluded he bore ultimate responsibility for the climate that allowed it to happen. It remains to this day one of the most serious constitutional controversies of the entire Cold War era, a moment when officials inside the government simply decided the law did not apply to their own foreign policy goals. While the Iran-Contra story was unfolding in the world of covert cables and secret bank accounts, something entirely different, and rather more personal, was quietly happening just down the hall in the White House residence. This is secret number 77. After the attempt on Reagan's life in March of 1981, First Lady Nancy Reagan grew deeply, privately anxious about her husband's safety, and she began secretly consulting a San Francisco astrologer named Joan Quigley. For roughly the next 7 years, Quigley would help Nancy determine which days were astrologically favorable or unfavorable for the president, information that Nancy then used to help time Reagan's travel, his public appearances, and even certain elements of his official schedule. Almost no one inside the White House knew the extent of the arrangement while it was happening. It only came to light publicly in 1988, after Reagan's former chief of staff, Donald Reagan, who had been forced out of his job partly over friction with Nancy, described the relationship in a memoir. The revelation was met with a mixture of astonishment and gentle disbelief, a strange and human footnote to a presidency that, on its surface, always looked so carefully managed. Reagan's vice president for both terms was George H. W. Bush, and Bush's own connection to the Iran-Contra story would follow him for years afterward. This is secret number 78. As a member of Reagan's National Security Planning Group, Bush sat in rooms where at least some elements of the Iran-Contra operation were discussed, and for years he insisted publicly that he had been, in his own words, out of the loop. But Bush kept a private diary throughout his vice presidency, and when portions of it were eventually disclosed, they showed he had been briefed on the operation more thoroughly, and earlier than he had originally let on. The story did not end there. In December of 1992, in the final weeks of his own presidency, Bush issued pardons to 6 Iran-Contra figures, including former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, who was at that point facing an active criminal trial. The pardons effectively closed down the ongoing investigation led by independent counsel Lawrence Walsh, an investigation that some believed was drawing closer to Bush's own conduct as vice president. Bush defended the pardons as a matter of ending what he considered the criminalization of policy differences. Critics saw something else entirely, a president using his final days in office to protect people who might otherwise have been able to implicate him. Bush's presidency carried one more broken promise, quieter than Iran-Contra, but arguably just as costly to him personally. This is secret number 79. Accepting his party's nomination in 1988, Bush had delivered one of the most famous lines in modern campaign history, telling the convention crowd, "Read my lips, no new taxes." It was a pledge delivered with total confidence, and it helped carry him to victory that November. But by 1990, faced with a ballooning federal deficit and pressure from both parties in Congress, Bush agreed to a bipartisan budget deal that included new tax increases, a reversal of the single promise his campaign had been built around. Many economists later credited that deal with helping stabilize the nation's finances heading into the following decade. His own political base did not see it that way at the time. Conservatives felt betrayed. Primary challenger Pat Buchanan used the broken pledge as a rallying cry against him in 1992, and the phrase "read my lips" followed Bush for the rest of his career, not as a promise kept, but as the very symbol of one that wasn't. As the Reagan and Bush years gave way to a new decade, a new president arrived carrying secrets of his own, some of them stretching back long before he ever reached the White House. This is secret number 80, the Whitewater investigation. Bill and Hillary Clinton had, back in the 1970s and 1980s, invested in a failed Arkansas real estate venture called the Whitewater Development Corporation, alongside business partners who later ran into serious legal trouble of their own. Questions about the Clintons' role in that venture eventually grew into a full independent counsel investigation, first led by Robert Fisk and then, starting in 1994, by Kenneth Starr. The inquiry stretched on for years, and in the end, it produced no criminal charges against either Bill or Hillary Clinton, personally connected to the original Whitewater dealings. But the investigation itself did not simply close once it reached that conclusion. Starr's mandate kept expanding. The costs kept climbing past $50 million, and the inquiry's reach kept extending further into corners of the Clinton presidency that had nothing to do with a 20-year-old Arkansas land deal. And it was in one of those unexpected corners, far from Whitewater's dusty old paperwork, that Starr's investigators would soon stumble onto something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with real estate, and everything to do with what was about to become the most talked about scandal of the entire decade. A different matter entirely. That's where we left off, and it's time to name it, gently, the way history eventually had to. Because the investigation that began digging through an Arkansas land deal would, by the strangest of paths, end up somewhere no one expected, in the private life of the sitting president himself. So settle back in, because secret number 81 is one you already know the shape of, even if you've never heard it told slowly. In January of 1998, Bill Clinton stood before the American people and, wagging his finger for emphasis, said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." He said it firmly. He said it more than once. And for months, the country genuinely did not know what to believe. Then, in August of 1998, under oath and under enormous pressure, he changed course, admitting to what he called an inappropriate relationship with a 22-year-old White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. Here's the thing worth remembering. The scandal itself was never really about the relationship in the eyes of the law. It was about what came after it, whether the president had lied under oath about it, and whether he had tried to obstruct the investigation into it. Those questions were serious enough that in December of 1998, the House of Representatives impeached him, only the second president in American history to face that fate, on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. The Senate trial that followed captivated the country for weeks. And on February 12, 1999, the Senate acquitted him on both counts, falling well short of the two-thirds vote needed to remove him from office. Clinton finished his term, but the finger wag, the denial, and the word impeached would sit beside his name in the history books forever after. Now, quietly rewind a few years, back to the very beginning of that same administration, for secret number 82. In the spring of 1993, the Clinton White House did something that seemed almost mundane on its surface. It fired all 7 career employees of the White House Travel Office, the small staff responsible for arranging press travel on Air Force One. But the manner of it raised eyebrows immediately. The employees were dismissed abruptly, accused publicly of financial mismanagement, and reporting at the time suggested the real motive was to steer the lucrative travel business toward associates and friends of the Clintons. An independent counsel investigated for years afterward and ultimately found insufficient evidence to bring criminal charges. But the final report was still sharply critical, describing the firings as improper and the public accusations against the employees as unfair. It became known, in the shorthand of the era, simply as Travelgate, a quiet reminder that scandal doesn't always require a crime to leave a mark. Secret number 83 carries us to the very last hours of the Clinton presidency, January 20th, 2001, the day a president's pardon power is at its most unchecked. Among a wave of pardons issued on his final morning in office, Clinton granted clemency to a fugitive financier named Mark Rich. Rich had fled to Switzerland back in 1983 to escape prosecution for tax evasion and for illegally trading oil with Iran during the very hostage crisis that had haunted Jimmy Carter's presidency. He had never served a single day, never faced a courtroom, never returned to American soil. And yet, on his way out the door, Clinton wiped his slate clean. It didn't help that Rich's ex-wife, Denise, had donated generously to Clinton's library and campaigns over the years. Lawmakers from both parties condemned the pardon as exactly what it looked like, a favor extended to the well-connected at the very last possible moment a president could grant one. With secret number 84, The story shifts to a new administration and a new kind of secret, one born from the debate over the Iraq War. In 2003, a former ambassador named Joseph Wilson publicly challenged one of the Bush administration's central claims used to justify the invasion. Shortly after, his wife's identity was leaked to the press, and she was not simply a diplomat's spouse. Valerie Plame was a covert CIA officer, and revealing her status was no small matter. The investigation that followed eventually led to the conviction, in 2007, of Vice President Cheney's chief of staff, Scooter Libby, on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. President Bush chose to commute Libby's prison sentence rather than pardon him outright, sparing him time behind bars while leaving the conviction itself on the books. And that brings us to secret number 85, the very foundation the Iraq War itself was built upon. The case for invasion rested heavily on the belief that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction ready to be used or shared. Those weapons were never found. Years later, a bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee investigation concluded that the underlying intelligence had been deeply flawed, and that in certain respects, it had been presented to the public with more certainty than the evidence actually supported. It remains one of the most consequential intelligence failures in modern American history. The years just after September 11th, it turns out, held far more secrets than most people realize, and some of the most unsettling ones are still ahead of us. Some of the most unsettling secrets as promised, and they begin in the shadows of the War on Terror itself, where the balance between safety and privacy was being redrawn in ways the public wouldn't learn about for years. Secret number 86 takes us into that shadow directly. In the aftermath of September 11th, the National Security Agency began a secret program of domestic surveillance, listening in on international communications involving people inside the United States without first obtaining warrants from a court. It stayed hidden until December of 2005, when the New York Times revealed its existence to the public. The response was immediate and divided. Supporters argued it was a necessary tool against an unprecedented threat. Critics argued it ran straight through the heart of the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches, and raised difficult questions about how much power a president could quietly claim in the name of national security without Congress or the courts ever weighing in beforehand. Close behind it, for secret number 87, came a set of documents that would later be known simply as the torture memos. Starting around 2002, lawyers inside the Justice Department drafted secret legal opinions authorizing specific interrogation techniques for use against terrorism suspects held at CIA black sites and at Guantanamo Bay, including waterboarding, a practice with a long and grim history. These memos stayed classified for years, while the techniques were quietly put into practice. When the details eventually surfaced, they sparked one of the most difficult moral debates of the era. A later bipartisan Senate report examined the program at length and used blunt language to describe what had happened, language that left little room for euphemism. To this day, the legal memos and the program they authorized remain among the most scrutinized chapters of the post-9/11 years. Let's move forward now gently into a new decade and a new administration for secret number 88. In 2013, a Treasury Department Inspector General released a report that set off a firestorm in Washington. It found that the Internal Revenue Service had subjected certain nonprofit groups applying for tax-exempt status to extra scrutiny and delay, specifically groups with words like Tea Party or Patriot in their names, terms strongly associated with conservative political organizing. The revelation was treated as a serious breach of the IRS's obligation to remain neutral, and a senior official named Lois Lerner resigned amid the fallout after invoking her right against self-incrimination before Congress. It's worth noting, in fairness, that later reporting complicated the initial picture somewhat, finding that some progressive-leaning groups had also been flagged using similarly broad search terms during the same review process. Either way, the episode did lasting damage to public trust in the agency's impartiality. For secret number 89, we turn to a law enforcement operation that ended in real tragedy. Beginning in 2009, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives ran an operation, later known as Fast and Furious, in which agents allowed illegally purchased firearms to cross the border into Mexico, hoping to track them upward through the supply chains of drug cartels to the people actually running them. It was a gamble, and it went badly wrong. Many of the weapons were lost track of entirely. Then, in December of 2010, two of those very guns turned up at the scene where Border Patrol agent Brian Terry was shot and killed. The fallout reached all the way to Attorney General Eric Holder, though an Inspector General's investigation later found no evidence that Holder had known about the operation before it became public. Still, Congress, frustrated by what it saw as a stonewalled document request, voted to hold him in contempt, a first for a sitting Attorney General, after President Obama invoked executive privilege over some of the disputed records, itself a first of his presidency. And for secret number 90, a very different kind of controversy, this one about money rather than guns. As part of a stimulus program meant to jumpstart clean energy, the Obama administration guaranteed a $535 million federal loan to a solar panel company called Solyndra. In 2011, Solyndra collapsed into bankruptcy, and the loan guarantee went with it. A Department of Energy Inspector General later found that the company had made false and misleading statements in order to secure the loan in the first place. Critics pointed to the company's ties to a major campaign donor and questioned whether political relationships had influenced which companies received the government's backing. It became, for a while, a symbol in the broader argument over how government should or shouldn't pick winners in the marketplace. There's one more secret waiting from those Obama years, and it involves a name that would go on to define an entirely different kind of national conversation about privacy. A name that would go on to define an entirely different kind of national conversation about privacy, and it belongs to secret number 91. In the summer of 2013, a young NSA contractor named Edward Snowden leaked a vast trove of classified documents to journalists, revealing that the agency had, for years, been collecting the phone and internet metadata of millions of ordinary Americans in bulk. The program itself had actually begun under the previous administration, but it continued and expanded under Obama, largely out of public view. When the leaks broke, they set off one of the most significant public debates about surveillance and civil liberties in a generation, forcing lawmakers, courts, and everyday citizens alike to ask how much of their digital lives their own government was quietly watching. Snowden fled the country and has lived in exile ever since, a figure who remains even now deeply divisive, hero to some, traitor to others. That debate over privacy and power was still unsettled when the country turned to a wholly different kind of controversy, one that had nothing to do with government surveillance and everything to do with a single recording. Secret number 92 takes us to October of 2016, just weeks before a presidential election, when a 2005 recording surfaced from behind the scenes of an entertainment show called Access Hollywood. On it, Donald Trump could be heard making vulgar remarks about women. The tape spread instantly and dominated the news cycle for days. Trump apologized publicly, calling it locker room talk, and weathered the fallout well enough to continue his campaign. Looking back, it stands as one of the most consequential October surprises in modern American political history, a moment many assumed would end a candidacy, and didn't. Close on its heels chronologically sits secret number 93, though the full picture of it wouldn't come into focus for years. In October of 2016, just days before that same election, Trump's personal lawyer at the time, Michael Cohen, arranged a $130,000 payment to an adult film performer named Stormy Daniels in exchange for her silence about a past encounter she said she'd had with Trump. Cohen pleaded guilty in 2018 to campaign finance violations connected to the payment. The matter seemed, for years, to be a settled and closed chapter. Then, in May of 2024, a New York jury convicted Trump on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records, related to how the reimbursement to Cohen had been logged internally, making him the first former president in American history to be convicted of a felony. We'll simply note here calmly that the facts of the payment and the conviction are documented. How history ultimately weighs it is still being written. From there, we move to secret number 94, and a name that dominated headlines for nearly 2 years, Robert Mueller. As special counsel, Mueller led an exhaustive investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election and into the contacts between Trump's campaign and Russian officials during that same period. When his report was finally released in 2019, it documented numerous contacts between campaign associates and Russian-linked individuals, and it laid out in careful detail several episodes that raised questions of potential obstruction of justice. But Mueller stopped short of establishing, beyond a reasonable doubt, a provable criminal conspiracy between the campaign and the Russian government, what the public had come to call collusion. Both sides of the political aisle would spend years afterward arguing over what exactly that finding did and didn't mean. And that brings us gently to secret number 95, and the first of two impeachments in Trump's political story. On July 25, 2019, Trump held a phone call with Ukraine's newly elected president, during which he asked for an investigation into Joe Biden, his political rival at the time, and Biden's son Hunter. A whistleblower complaint about the call became public that fall, and on December 18, 2019, the House of Representatives impeached Trump for a first time on charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The Senate trial concluded on February 5, 2020, with an acquittal on both counts. One moment from that vote is worth remembering quietly on its own. Republican Senator Mitt Romney of Utah broke from his party to vote guilty on the abuse of power charge, becoming the first senator in American history to vote to convict a president belonging to his own political party. We're closing in now on the end of our list, and what remains are some of the most recent secrets of all, close enough to today that many of you watching lived through them yourselves. Close enough to today, in fact, that our next secret happened in front of the entire country. Live in real time. Secret number 96 is the second of Trump's two impeachments, and it followed one of the most chaotic days in the history of the Capitol. On January 6, 2021, as Congress met to certify Joe Biden's election victory, a crowd of Trump supporters who had gathered nearby after hearing him speak stormed the Capitol building in an attempt to disrupt the certification. 1 week later, on January 13, 2021, the House impeached Trump a second time on a charge of incitement of insurrection, making him the only president in American history to be impeached twice. The Senate voted on February 13, 2021, and the result was 57 in favor of conviction to 43 against, a majority of senators, but well short of the two-thirds threshold the Constitution requires, so Trump was acquitted once again. From there, quietly, secret number 97 begins after his term had already ended. Once out of office, Trump kept hundreds of documents marked classified at his Mar-a-Lago residence in Florida. In August of 2022, the FBI executed a search warrant there and recovered a substantial number of them. In 2023, Trump was indicted at the federal level over his handling of the documents and the government's efforts to retrieve them. That case did not proceed to trial. It was ultimately dismissed following Trump's victory in the 2024 election, consistent with long-standing Justice Department policy against prosecuting a sitting president. Which leads us to secret number 98, from the very first day of that second term. On January 20th, 2025, one of Trump's first acts back in office was to grant clemency to nearly all of the roughly 1,500 people who had been charged in connection with the January 6th Capitol attack, including individuals convicted of violent offenses. Among them, the sentence of Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio, who had been serving 22 years for seditious conspiracy, was commuted to time served, as was the 18-year sentence of Oath Keepers founder Stewart Rhodes. It stands, simply as a matter of historical record, as one of the broadest uses of the presidential clemency power in American history, applied to people convicted of crimes connected to an attack on the government itself. Now, softly, back to the other side of that same story, for secret number 99. In November of 2022, lawyers for Joe Biden discovered a small number of documents marked classified at his former office space at the Penn Biden Center, a think tank he had been affiliated with after his vice presidency. More documents turned up the following month, this time in the garage of his home in Wilmington, Delaware. Attorney General Merrick Garland appointed a special counsel, Robert Hur, to investigate. When Hur's report was released in 2024, it declined to recommend criminal charges, but it was notably pointed in its criticism of how Biden had handled sensitive material, and it included candid observations about Biden's memory that became a significant political story in their own right. And so we arrive, at last, at our 100th and final secret. In October of 2020, a laptop reportedly belonging to Hunter Biden, the president's son, surfaced publicly, containing emails that referenced his business dealings abroad, including his role on the board of the Ukrainian gas company Burisma and various dealings with Chinese business entities. Years later, in June of 2024, Hunter Biden was convicted on federal felony charges related to lying about drug use on a firearm purchase application. That September, he pleaded guilty to federal tax charges covering several years of unpaid taxes. Then in December of 2024, in the final weeks of his presidency, Joe Biden pardoned his son for these offenses, a decision that closed out one of the more personal chapters in this entire 100 Secret history. And with that, we've reached the end of the list. 100 secrets spanning more than 200 years, from a first president who nearly refused the office altogether to a father pardoning his son on his way out the door. What strikes you, looking back over all of it, isn't really scandal at all. It's how human the presidency has always been, an office held by ordinary, flawed people asked to carry extraordinary weight, who stumbled, who covered up, who occasionally rose to something better than themselves, and who left behind a record that history has never stopped studying. Every triumph in that record sits beside an error, and both are remembered, because both are true. So as you drift off tonight, let the weight of 2 centuries settle quietly around you, and know that tomorrow the story simply continues, one more page at a time. Rest well. Good night.